I want to tell this carefully because for a long time I didn't tell it carefully at all. I either hid it behind jokes, or I reduced it to one strange little detail that sounded easier to explain than the truth. The joke version was that I borrowed my wife's skin cream one winter because my hands were dry, and somehow that started a chain reaction. The dramatic version was that one small, harmless act opened a door that changed my life forever. Both of those versions contain a grain of truth, but neither one is honest enough to be useful, and if I'm going to share this as a real story about identity, shame, marriage, fear, and the long process of learning how to live without lying to myself every day, then I have to start much earlier than a bathroom counter and a jar of cream. I have to start with the kind of child I was, the kind of house I grew up in, the kind of silence that shapes a person long before they have the words to describe what is happening inside them. I was not raised in a cruel home, and I want to say that first because it matters. My parents worked hard, loved us in the ways they knew how, and believed they were preparing us for life by teaching us what a man should be and what a woman should be and how confusing the world could become if those lines were not held firmly in place. My father was not a monster. He was a tired man with calloused hands, strict habits, and a belief that emotional discipline was the only reliable form of protection available to ordinary people. My mother was gentler, but gentleness in our home had limits. There were feelings you could have, and feelings you were expected to outgrow. There were interests considered acceptable, and others that would be treated as warning signs. My sister could be messy and imaginative and dramatic and sentimental. I was expected to be steady. Even before I understood those rules, I felt them. I felt them in the clothes bought for me, the praise given to me, the jokes relatives made when I was too quiet or too soft-spoken, the way adults laughed uneasily when a boy lingered too long in the girls' section of anything, whether that meant toys, television, or behavior. I learned very early that identity was not only something you discovered. It was also something other people guarded for you, corrected for you, and sometimes punished you back into. When I was little, I didn't think in language like gender or expression or dysphoria. I thought in much simpler terms. I thought that some things made my chest loosen, and some things made it tighten. I thought that certain ways of moving through the world felt natural, and others felt like performing a school play that never ended. I remember watching my mother and sister get ready for church, not with the kind of attention that people later assume when they want to make a story sound salacious, but with a kind of longing that was difficult to name. It was the softness of it, the slowness, the permission. They seemed allowed to take themselves seriously in physical space. They could adjust a collar, smooth their hair, choose a color, stand in front of a mirror, and ask themselves how they felt. The men in my family did not do that. Men got dressed quickly, as if the body were a tool to sheath and move along. Men were not meant to linger. Men were not meant to study themselves too closely unless it had something to do with shaving, injury, or age. I didn't want makeup. I didn't have some grandchild's fantasy of becoming somebody else overnight. What I wanted, though I could not have said it then, was access to that gentler vocabulary of being. I wanted softness without ridicule. I wanted to be allowed to care how something felt against my skin. I wanted to stop feeling as if every room had already decided what I was before I walked into it. As a child, the first shame I remember wasn't about sexuality. It was about attention. I found myself drawn to textures, colors, and rituals that belonged to the women around me, and the minute I noticed that this drew reactions from others, I panicked. Adults can underestimate how early a child learns the cost of being observed the wrong way. You don't need a lecture. Sometimes all it takes is a glance, a laugh from across a room, an aunt saying, "That's not for boys," with an amused tone that still manages to feel like a door closing. I became self-conscious in layers. First, I learned not to reach. Then I learned not to look too long. Then I learned not to ask certain questions, because even innocent curiosity could be reinterpreted into something suspicious if it crossed the wrong invisible line. By the time I was 10 or 11, I had developed a private interior world that looked calm from the outside. I did what I was supposed to do. I played the sports I could tolerate, though never with the natural aggression some adults kept waiting to see in me. I learned how to lower my voice when I was nervous. I learned how to laugh at jokes that made me uncomfortable so no one would stop and ask why I wasn't laughing. And because children are adaptive in heartbreaking ways, I also learned to think of my discomfort not as information, but as evidence of personal weakness. The problem, I concluded, was not that the role fit badly. The problem was that I wasn't trying hard enough to fit it. Adolescence made everything harder because adolescence makes the body impossible to ignore. Until then, I had lived with a diffuse kind of unease. Puberty condensed it into something sharper. Suddenly, every difference between boys and girls was treated as destiny, and every adult around us seemed invested in rehearsing that destiny before it had even finished arriving. The boys I knew were expected to become louder, harder, more careless in some ways and more territorial in others. Desire was spoken of, crudely but approvingly if it was directed outward, especially toward girls in ways I found deeply alienating. Tenderness was either feminized or mocked. Confusion became anger. Vulnerability became isolation. At school, I watched boys compete not only in sports or status, but in a strange kind of self-erasure. The more embarrassed they were of their need for comfort, reassurance, or beauty, the more aggressively they performed, not needing any of it. I copied them badly. I knew enough to imitate the posture, but not enough to inhabit it. That left me in a painful middle ground, where people sensed something different about me without being able to name it, and I sensed it too without having a framework that made me feel less broken. There were nights when I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror and tried to identify exactly what felt wrong. I didn't hate my reflection in a theatrical way. I didn't smash mirrors or cry every time I got dressed. It was quieter than that, and because it was quieter, it lasted longer. I felt misaligned. I felt as though the version of me other people responded to had become more real to them than the private self I was still guarding. And because I had no language for exploration that wasn't immediately associated with ridicule or scandal, I told no one. The private experiments started small, furtive, and clumsy. I don't say that proudly, and I don't say it to romanticize secrecy. Secrecy warps people. But if I'm honest, those hidden moments were the first times I let myself ask a question instead of suppressing it. When I was alone, I sometimes touched fabrics that were not mine, or stood in front of the mirror with an object, a gesture, or a piece of clothing that crossed some forbidden border in my mind. The emotional content of those moments was almost never excitement in the way outsiders tend to imagine. It was relief mixed with fear. Relief because something in me softened when I stopped policing myself so harshly. Fear because relief itself felt dangerous. If an action brought me peace, but I had been taught that peace could only come from something shameful, then even comfort became incriminating. Afterward, I would rush to put everything back exactly where I had found it, heart pounding, not because anyone had actually caught me, but because I had internalized the sense that I was trespassing against the rules of personhood. I prayed at times. I bargained. I promised myself I would stop. Then I would stop for a while, and the pressure would build again until I felt split in two. One part of me wanted to be normal, which at that age simply meant invisible. The other part of me wanted to know why pretending felt heavier than honesty, even when honesty existed only in the briefest secret moments. I made it into early adulthood by doing what many frightened people do. I became highly functional. Function is one of the best hiding places in the world. If you show up on time, study hard, get a job, keep your apartment clean enough, date in a socially acceptable way, and don't cause public trouble, most people stop looking beneath the surface. They assume coherence where there is only discipline. I learned that lesson well. I went to school, worked, laughed when expected, and built an identity made of all the things that could be verified from the outside. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't obviously unhappy. I was, in many ways, decent company. But there is a difference between being decent company and being deeply present in your own life. I dated women because I loved women, because I genuinely connected with them, because I could be emotionally close with them in ways I often could not be with men, and because being with women did not contradict the part of me I had been taught was fixed. In fact, for a while it helped me feel steadier. I told myself that whatever confusion I carried about myself would settle down once adulthood became real enough. Once I had work responsibilities, a mortgage someday, maybe children, maybe a full set of ordinary stresses, perhaps that old inner restlessness would finally shrink into irrelevance. That is one of the saddest myths I ever believed, that adulthood naturally cures inner conflict. It doesn't. It simply gives you more sophisticated tools for postponing it. When I met the woman who became my wife, I did not feel I was lying to her in some deliberate predatory way, and that matters to me because I have spent years being honest with myself about what I did get wrong and what I did not understand at the time. I loved her. I still care about her with a gratitude that survives everything that came later. She was intelligent, funny, practical in the best sense, and emotionally sturdier than I was. She had a way of seeing through social performance without humiliating people for it. When I was with her, I felt less alone. I also felt less pressured to embody the loudest version of masculinity because she was not looking for that. She valued kindness. She liked careful people, observant people, people who listened. In the beginning, that felt like salvation. Here was someone with whom I could build a life that did not require me to become a caricature of a man just to be loved. And because that relationship truly nourished me, I pushed even harder against the part of my identity that remained unresolved. I told myself that love had settled the question. I told myself that the private discomfort was just residue from adolescence, harmless as long as it remained private, manageable as long as it did not interfere with the visible architecture of our life. That sounds naive now, but at the time it felt almost noble. I believed I was protecting what we had by containing the part of myself that could complicate it. I didn't yet understand that containment is not the same as maturity, and silence is not the same as integrity. Marriage changed me in beautiful ways before it changed me in painful ones. We built rhythms together. Grocery lists, long drives, shared jokes, bills, late-night conversations about work and family, arguments that started over something practical and ended in vulnerable places neither of us expected. I liked being someone's partner. I liked the ordinary intimacy of it. The world often talks about marriage as if its deepest moments are dramatic ones, but some of the deepest moments are domestic. Watching someone fold laundry with tired hands, hearing them cough in another room, and knowing the exact sound of air. Presence. Learning how they take their tea. Knowing when their silence means peace, and when it means worry. I loved all of that. I also noticed with a growing ache I refused to examine how much freedom women were allowed inside the category of care. My wife could have a skincare routine, and it was treated as sensible. She could say a sweater felt wrong, and try another. She could be upset, and it could be called stress rather than weakness. She could say she didn't feel like herself, and people understood the sentence. Men around me could also be tired or stressed, of course, but the vocabulary was narrower. We were expected to manage ourselves efficiently, not explore ourselves truthfully. I was not jealous of women in some simplistic way. I did not wish to appropriate their hardships or overlook what they faced. What I felt was more intimate and difficult. I saw in womanhood, as it was lived around me, certain permissions I had been denied, and those permissions touched something central in me. The night of the skin cream itself would not have changed my life if the rest of me had not already been waiting. That is the truth beneath the title. It was winter. My hands were dry enough to crack near the knuckles. I had ignored it for a week because ignoring discomfort was still my first reflex. My wife kept a jar of thick cream in the bathroom cabinet, expensive enough that I had always treated it as one of her things, part of a category I did not enter. That evening she was already asleep. I was standing in the bathroom under the harsh light, looking at my hands and feeling absurdly tired, and I opened the jar. I still remember the scent, not because it was intoxicating, but because it was clean and mild and somehow unfamiliar on my skin. I rubbed the cream into my hands, then my wrists because there was extra, then, on impulse, my face because the air had made everything dry. That should have been the end of it. But I looked up. My face was shinier than usual, softened a little. Not transformed. Not feminized in some dramatic sense. Just softened. And I felt something I had spent half my life trying not to feel. Tenderness toward myself. Not pride, not vanity, not thrill. Tenderness. I stood there much longer than I needed to, fingertips against my cheek, and suddenly the distance between the person I presented and the person I kept hidden felt unbearable in a new way. The cream did not create a new self. It interrupted a routine of emotional neglect. It let me experience my own body for a brief moment, not as a role to uphold or a problem to control, but as something deserving of care. That would sound small to many people, and perhaps it is small, but sometimes a person's life turns not on spectacle, but on the first ordinary act that exposes how starved they have been. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about that moment. I used the cream again, this time openly, making some passing comment about dry skin. My wife barely looked up from what she was doing and said, "Good, use it if you need it." Her tone was casual, generous, unguarded. Instead of relaxing me, that simple permission shook me. I had expected the old familiar gatekeeping to appear, some version of "that's not for you," but it didn't. And once the wall failed to appear, I had to confront that some of the prison I lived in was no longer external. It was built into me. Around that same time, work was stressful, my sleep was poor, and I had begun experiencing what I then would have called low-level depression. Everything was effortful. I moved through the days competently, but without texture. The skin cream became part of a small nighttime ritual, and soon I added other things that could still be defended as practical, filing my nails a little more neatly, paying attention to how fabrics felt, standing in the bathroom mirror longer than I used to. I wish I could say insight arrived immediately, but what actually arrived was resistance. Every gentle act triggered an argument in my head. Why are you doing this? What does it mean? Where does it stop? Are you just unhappy? Are you selfish? Are you inventing a problem because your life is too stable? That inner prosecution had rehearsed for years. It did not give up quietly. At first, the exploration remained narrow and private. I bought my own moisturizer. Then I lingered online late at night, searching not for anything explicit, but for language. Men who felt drawn to femininity. People who cross-dressed in non-sexual, non-performative ways. Accounts of gender questioning that were not framed as scandal. Stories from trans women who described childhoods full of vague misalignment rather than sudden certainty. Stories from men who dressed in women's clothing for comfort or expression but did not identify as women. Stories from people who had been married before they understood themselves clearly. Some of those stories gave me hope. Some terrified me. Some contradicted each other. Some seemed too polished to trust. But all of them did one crucial thing. They broke the isolation of thinking I was uniquely defective. I wasn't looking for a label to wear like a costume. I was looking for evidence that interior complexity did not automatically make me dishonest, perverse, or ruined. That search became, quietly, the second great turning point of my life. I began realizing that what I had buried under embarrassment and secrecy was not a trivial quirk. It was part of a larger question about embodiment, authenticity, and grief. Because there was grief in it. Grief for years spent policing myself. Grief for the adolescence I did not get to live honestly. Grief for the relationships I entered without fully understanding how much of me was still locked away. Grief for my wife too, though at that stage I did not yet know how much pain my silence would eventually bring her. The first time I dressed fully in women's clothing as an adult was not glamorous, and it was not emotionally simple. My wife was away visiting her mother for the weekend. I was alone in the house with too much time and too much courage. By then I had already crossed small lines in private, enough to know that the urge was not disappearing. I had also started to suspect that clothes themselves were not the central issue. The issue was what happened to my mind when I permitted certain forms of softness, shape, and presentation. That weekend I took a handful of items from the back of a closet, along with a simple top I had quietly purchased for myself online and hidden in a box in the garage like a frightened teenager. Even now, remembering it, I feel the sorrow of how afraid I was in my own home. I dressed slowly, with shaking hands. There was no dramatic reveal in the mirror. If anything, the first sight was awkward and humbling. I did not look like the women I admired. I did not suddenly look complete. I looked like a middle-aged person with a life and history written all over them, trying very carefully to touch something true without yet knowing how. I sat on the edge of the bed and cried, not because I thought I looked beautiful, but because the crying came from somewhere older than aesthetics. I had spent years telling myself that whatever this was could be dismissed, contained, or corrected. But sitting there, feeling an undeniable stillness inside for the first time in a long time, I understood that my life was organized around avoiding knowledge. And the knowledge had arrived anyway. It is tempting in stories like this to move from discovery directly into liberation, but that would erase the hardest part, which was what came next. Once you recognize something essential in yourself, you still have to decide what kind of person you will be about it. Will you hide it and build a double life? Will you confess impulsively and make your crisis everyone else's emergency? Will you investigate responsibly? Will you seek help? Will you use your confusion as an excuse to stop considering the people who love you? Those were ethical questions, not just emotional ones, and I did not answer them perfectly. For a while, I lived in between. I continued reading in secret. I experimented more when alone. I developed language in my journal that I was too afraid to speak aloud. Sometimes I wrote, "I think I am just a man with a hidden feminine side." Sometimes I wrote, "Maybe I am more than that." Sometimes I wrote, "If I were born differently, would this have hurt less?" The journal filled with questions and contradictions. At work, I became more distracted. At home, I became strangely attentive, as if overfunctioning could compensate for what I was withholding. I did more chores without being asked. I listened carefully. I tried harder to be affectionate. My wife noticed something was off before she knew anything specific. Intimacy in a marriage is not only about disclosure. It is also about atmosphere. She could feel I was present and absent at the same time. She asked me more than once if I was depressed. I said maybe. She asked if work was overwhelming. I said probably. She asked if I was angry with her. I said no, never. All of that was true, and all of it was incomplete. What I feared most was not discussed, though I feared that too. What I feared most was causing harm through confusion. I knew enough, even then, to understand that my self-discovery was not occurring in a vacuum. I had made vows. I had responsibilities. We shared a life, and the life we shared had not been built on transparent terms, even if the opacity was not fully intentional. That realization produced a kind of moral panic in me. I did not want to become the sort of person who used private suffering as a license for carelessness. At the same time, the pressure of concealment was becoming unsustainable. I was sleeping badly, having trouble concentrating, and swinging between numbness and emotions so quickly that even I stopped trusting my own assessments. One afternoon, alone in my car during lunch, I finally did something I should have done much sooner. I called a therapist. Not because I was ready to come out or make decisions, but because I had reached the limit of what secrecy could solve. That first appointment changed my life less dramatically than people might expect, and more fundamentally than I understood at the time. The therapist did not tell me who I was. She did not rush me toward any label. She asked quiet questions and waited for honest answers. She paid attention not only to what I described, but to the emotional charge around certain topics. When I told her about the clothes, I was almost shaking. I expected either alarm or easy reassurance. Instead, she said something like, "It sounds as if you have spent a very long time trying not to know yourself, and now you're beginning to." I remember feeling both seen and frightened by that sentence. Because if that was true, then learning myself was not a hobby. It was work, and it would touch everything. Therapy gave me structure, but not immediate peace. In some ways, it made the conflict more visible because I stopped numbing it so effectively. We talked about childhood, about masculinity, about the difference between desire and identity, about shame, about the way secrecy can become self-reinforcing. She encouraged me to notice patterns rather than chase conclusions. When did the need to present femininely feel strongest? What emotions preceded it? What emotions followed it? Did it feel like costume, release, alignment, escape, mourning, or some combination? Could I distinguish moments of curiosity from moments of despair? Could I separate what I wanted from what I feared other people would say it meant? Those questions slowed me down in a healthy way. I stopped treating my interior life like a courtroom where only definitive verdicts mattered. Instead, I began treating it like a landscape I had avoided and now had to walk through patiently. Some days I concluded I was a man who needed greater freedom of expression and self-care. Other days I felt the conclusion was too small, too defensive, more about preserving my existing life than describing my inner truth. The therapist never pushed, but she did challenge me when I tried to translate every vulnerable feeling into the safest acceptable category. I respected that. She cared not about comfort, but about accuracy. Accuracy, I discovered, can be a form of mercy. Telling my wife remains one of the hardest conversations of my life, not because I had to say words aloud, but because I had to accept that my honesty would wound someone I loved no matter how carefully I expressed it. There is no perfect script for revealing to a spouse that your inner life contains something you have not understood well enough to share sooner. We were sitting at the kitchen table. The light outside had already gone dim. I had rehearsed versions of the conversation for weeks and discarded them all because each one either sounded too vague to be meaningful or too dramatic to be fair. In the end, I started badly. I said I had been struggling with something for a long time. She went very still. I think she thought I was about to tell her I had been unfaithful. In a way, that possibility would have fit a script she understood better than what actually followed. I told her I had been questioning things about my identity, about femininity, about presentation, about myself in ways I had not known how to explain. I told her I had tried on women's clothes in private. I told her this did not come from a lack of love for her, but from a confusion and longing I had carried since childhood. I told her I was in therapy. I told her I was terrified. There were long silences between my sentences. Her face changed several times, not theatrically, but like weather shifting over a landscape you know well enough to read. Shock, hurt, calculation, anger, sadness. She asked me the kinds of questions any reasonable spouse might ask when handed a truth that rearranges the past.
Since when?
Why didn't you tell me?
Does this mean you don't want me?
Does this mean our marriage was built on a lie? Are you saying you're gay? Are you saying you're trans?
Are you leaving me?
Are you asking for permission? The brutal thing about such moments is that the questions often arrive before the answers do. I could answer some clearly. I loved her. I was not having an affair. I had hidden this because I was ashamed and confused, not because I enjoyed deceiving her. Other questions I could not answer honestly yet. I did not know what the end of this process would reveal. Saying that out loud felt unforgivable, but pretending certainty would have been another betrayal. I wish I could say she cried in my arms and we understood each other immediately. That is not what happened. She was too hurt and too destabilized for that. She needed distance. She said she felt as though I had invited a stranger into our marriage without her consent. Hearing that nearly broke me because it contained truth, even if not the whole truth. People sometimes romanticize self-discovery so much that they flatten the collateral pain around it. I don't want to do that. My struggle was real, but so was hers. She had married a person under one set of assumptions, and now those assumptions were under review. She was allowed to grieve. She was allowed to feel frightened, embarrassed, angry, even misled. Compassion did not require her to skip those stages. In the weeks that followed, our house became heavy with carefulness. We were not screaming. We were not cruel. In some ways that made it harder, because tenderness remained, but it was interrupted by uncertainty. She asked for time. She asked me not to use her things anymore. That boundary was fair. I bought my own clothes quietly and kept them contained. I continued therapy. Eventually we tried couples counseling, which was painful and necessary. There we had to speak not only about identity, but about trust, timelines, intimacy, and the difference between explanation and excuse. I learned to say, I understand why this hurts you, without immediately adding, but I was hurting too. Both things were true, but one does not cancel the other. If I wanted to become more honest, that honesty had to include my impact, not only my experience. What surprised me during that period was how much of the fear was social, even inside the home. My wife worried about what this would mean for our families, our friends, our future, the stories people would invent, the pity they would offer her, the assumptions they would make about our marriage. I worried about those things too, but I also worried about what would happen if I never explored any further and simply retreated again into safety. Would I become depressed in a way that hollowed me out permanently? Would resentment grow where love used to live? Would I learn to lie more elegantly? Sometimes social norms become most visible when you approach their edges. We saw, in real time, how few scripts exist for ordinary adults trying to navigate gender complexity with decency. There were extreme narratives available everywhere. Either this was trivial and should be suppressed to protect normal life, or it was a revelation that should instantly justify every disruption. Neither position matched the textured moral reality we were living. I wasn't trying to explode my life. She wasn't trying to crush me. We were two frightened people trying to understand whether truth could coexist with the commitments we had made. Some days I thought yes. Other days I thought our love might survive only in altered form. Learning to live inside that uncertainty required a kind of humility I had not practiced before. As my exploration continued, the distinction between crossdressing and gender identity became increasingly important. I had to be careful not to use one term as a shield against the other. There were periods when dressing femininely in private felt sufficient. It brought relief, allowed emotional range, and helped me understand how deeply presentation affected my sense of self. But there were also periods when the relief faded and something deeper remained unresolved. I began noticing that what mattered was not only clothing. It was naming, social role, body language, voice recognition, and the exhausting effort of maintaining a version of myself that no longer felt neutral. Once you notice how much energy goes into self-suppression, you cannot entirely unnotice it. I would be at the grocery store, doing nothing unusual, and suddenly feel intensely aware of how I was moving, standing, gesturing, speaking, as if every part of me had been trained into a posture that kept me legible while making me less alive. That awareness did not mean I instantly knew I was a woman. It meant the old category of man, as I had inhabited it, no longer felt stable enough to live inside without question. Therapy deepened. I began experimenting more intentionally, sometimes at home when my wife was out, sometimes in private online support spaces where people spoke with disarming honesty about transition, partial transition, social risk, family complexity, and the fact that self-knowledge often arrives gradually rather than all at once. I listened more than I spoke. I did not want to borrow an identity from community before I had earned my own clarity. But I also needed to know that thoughtful, ethical people had walked this road before me. The first time I went outside presenting in a more feminine way was not an act of bravery, so much as an act of necessity. I had reached a point where total privacy was reinforcing panic. I chose a nearby town where I knew I was unlikely to run into anyone. I wore simple clothing, understated, nothing theatrical, and even then I nearly turned the car around 3 times. The body keeps score in strange ways. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. Every imagined gaze felt like a threat. And yet, once I was there, something unexpected happened. Most people did not pay much attention. A cashier smiled politely. An older woman held the door. A teenage employee barely looked up. The ordinariness of it shook me more than ridicule would have. I had built this wall of anticipated catastrophe around the act of appearing differently in public, and while the risk was real, the world in that moment did not center me enough to react dramatically. I sat in my car afterward and cried again, not from fear this time, but from the realization that I had structured my life around preventing scenes that often existed more vividly in my head than in reality. That doesn't mean the danger was imaginary. People do face rejection, harassment, and worse. I do not minimize that, but my own fear had become indiscriminate. It had labeled any deviation as fatal. That day gave me a more grounded basis for courage. Courage is not believing nothing bad can happen. Courage is learning that your life cannot be governed entirely by forecasts of humiliation. Still, progress did not move in a straight line. There were setbacks, sometimes internal, sometimes relational. My wife and I had periods of better communication followed by periods of grief, so sharp it felt like we were losing each other in slow motion. There were practical questions about intimacy that neither of us could solve through compassion alone. Attraction, comfort, trust, and future vision all mattered. Love does not erase those questions. We had nights of profound tenderness in which we spoke honestly about fear and loneliness, and nights where one poorly chosen phrase reopened everything. Sometimes she said she missed the simplicity of before, and I understood. Sometimes I said there had never truly been a before, only a version of me that costs less to explain, and she winced because truth can sound cruel even when it isn't meant that way. We tried to be fair. We also failed each other in ordinary human ways. I withdrew when overwhelmed. She shut down when hurt. We misread silence. We protected ourselves when we should have risked vulnerability. But through all of it, one thing changed in me that I now consider fundamental. I stopped treating self-denial as a virtue. Not because every desire deserves enactment, but because denial had become my default moral language. If something in me was difficult, I assumed the honorable response was suppression. Therapy taught me a more nuanced ethic. The honorable response is not always to repress. Sometimes it is to investigate carefully, act responsibly, tell the truth, and accept the consequences without dramatizing yourself into the victim of your own honesty. My understanding of womanhood also changed during these years, and that change mattered because I did not want my story to become one more shallow narrative in which femininity is reduced to products, clothes, or aesthetics. The deeper I went, the more I understood that my longing was not for a stereotype. It was not about glamour. If anything, the more honestly I engaged with women in my life and in community, the more I appreciated the seriousness of what I was touching. Womanhood was not softness without burden. It was not permission without cost. It involved social scrutiny, vulnerability, expectation, labor, danger, and forms of resilience I had previously taken for granted from a distance. Realizing that actually made me gentler and more careful. I did not want to claim belonging through imitation. I wanted to understand why femininity, in both symbolic and embodied ways, had become the language through which parts of me finally spoke.
Some of that was about care, yes.
Some about beauty. Some about social positioning. Some about the grief of never having been allowed to grow naturally toward what felt true. And some of it was simply about recognition. There were moments when I would catch my reflection, not polished, not idealized, but honest, and feel a quiet click inside, the way a key fits a lock after years of rattling uselessly at the wrong door. That click mattered more than any compliment I ever received. Eventually, the question of transition moved from abstract possibility to live consideration. I did not leap into it. I read. I spoke to professionals. I listened to people whose experiences were very different from mine, as well as those disturbingly similar. I considered age, health, marriage, work, family, visibility, and whether I was mistaking relief from crossdressing for a broader identity truth. This was not a decision I treated lightly, because even the possibility of medical transition carries implications that deserve seriousness. What tipped the balance was not one cinematic epiphany. It was accumulation. The longer I permitted honesty, the more unsustainable the old role became. The relief I felt when living even partially aligned did not fade as novelty. It deepened into steadiness. The distress I felt when forcing myself back into my previous presentation did not fade as discipline. It intensified into grief. I began to understand that the question was no longer, can I survive without changing? The question was, what kind of survival am I defending, and at what cost? There is a difference between staying alive and remaining reachable to yourself. I had been alive for years. I was less certain I had been reachable. Telling our families was another chapter of pain, and again, I want to resist simplification. Some people responded better than expected. Some responded worse. Some tried and failed. Some used love as a reason to urge denial, believing sincerely that they were protecting me from suffering. My mother cried quietly and asked whether she had done something wrong. That question pierced me because it revealed how parents turn their child's truth into a referendum on their own adequacy. I told her no, and I meant it in the limited but important sense that identity is not a parental error to diagnose backward. My father reacted with the stunned silence of a man who had never developed the tools required for this conversation. For months his discomfort came out as practical deflection. Had I thought about work? Had I thought about what people would say? Had I thought about how hard life already is without making it harder? Underneath those questions was fear, but he did not know how to say fear without translating it into criticism. My sister, to my surprise, adapted more quickly than anyone. She did not pretend to understand everything. She simply chose relationship before mastery. "You don't need me to know exactly how this feels," she said once. "You need me not to make it harder." That sentence stayed with me. It became a standard by which I evaluated not only others' responses, but my own behavior toward people whose lives I did not fully understand. We do not always need immediate comprehension to offer dignity. Sometimes we need restraint, curiosity, and the refusal to confuse our uncertainty with another person's guilt. Work brought a different challenge because work runs on legibility. Institutions like categories, forms, introductions, and predictable interpersonal scripts. Changing how I presented was not only personal, it was administrative, social, and professional. I dreaded it. I imagined endless whispers, condescension disguised as support, or people becoming strangely fascinated by details that were none of their business. Some of that happened, though less than I feared. What happened more often was awkwardness. Awkwardness is not trivial. It wears on the nervous system, but it is survivable. I had to learn that not every uncomfortable interaction was a moral emergency or a referendum on my validity. Some people were just clumsy. Some were trying. Some avoided me because they didn't know what to say. Some surprised me with quiet professionalism that felt like grace. Through all of it, I began to understand resilience differently. For much of my life, I had thought resilience meant enduring yourself in silence. Now I began seeing resilience as the capacity to remain ethically grounded while being visibly misunderstood. That was a much harder skill. It required boundaries without bitterness, patience without self-erasure, and enough self-respect not to collapse every time someone failed to recognize me correctly. Mental health during this period became an active practice rather than a background concept. I learned how strongly my mood correlated with authenticity, sleep, social support, and the degree to which I was fragmenting myself to keep others comfortable. I also learned that transition or increased expression is not a cure-all. Pain does not vanish when truth arrives. New problems emerge. Old grief resurfaces. But the pain changes character. It becomes pain in motion, not pain in stasis. The hardest truth I had to face was that honesty does not guarantee preservation. My marriage, despite real effort and genuine care, could not remain what it had been. This is the part some people will want me to simplify into blame or redemption, but life is often less satisfying than that. There was no villain. There were wounds, mismatches, timing, and limits. My wife supported me in some ways that I still consider generous. She also reached boundaries she could not cross without betraying her own reality. That too had to be respected. A spouse is not morally obligated to reconfigure attraction, identity, and future vision on command, however compassionate they may be. We spent a long time trying to discern what could endure and in what form. In the end, the shape of our marriage changed permanently. To speak of that with full honesty would require protecting details that belong not only to me, so I will say it this way. We loved each other enough to stop pretending love alone solved every structural truth. That realization broke my heart. It also matured me. For years I had feared that authenticity would make me selfish. In some moments it did make me self-focused. But if pursued responsibly, authenticity also forces you to encounter the full humanity of others. It does not entitle you to their adaptation. It asks you to stop building closeness on omission. The grief of what changed between us remains one of the deepest griefs of my life. And yet, even there, I learned something essential. Mourning is not proof that truth was a mistake. Sometimes mourning is the cost of refusing to continue a lie, even a lie built partly out of love. There was a stretch after that where I felt suspended between ruins and possibility. I had lost the old stability and had not yet built the new one. Those are dangerous seasons. They are the seasons when people are most tempted by false certainties, by communities that promise instant belonging if you repeat the right script, by narratives that erase nuance because nuance hurts too much. I nearly fell into some of that. When your life is changing faster than your nervous system can process, certainty feels medicinal. But I had spent too much of my life living by borrowed certainties already. I did not want to exchange one rigid role for another. So I continued doing the slower work.
Therapy.
Reading. Honest friendships. Practical habits. Medical consultation approached with seriousness rather than ideology. I cultivated a small circle of people before whom I did not have to perform coherence. That mattered more than I can explain. Being seen in transition, in ambiguity, in grief, without being pushed into spectacle, gave me room to integrate instead of fracture. I also began speaking more carefully about crossdressing itself. For some people, that term described a stable and sufficient reality. For me, it had been both real and partial. It was one of the first available languages through which I could approach myself, but it was not the final map. I don't regret that phase. I respect it. It was a bridge, and bridges matter even when you do not live on them forever. Over time, what had once felt impossible became ordinary. That sentence contains years. Years of practical decisions, awkward appointments, quiet triumphs, difficult conversations, names learned and relearned, old photos reinterpreted, clothing becoming less symbolic and more normal, self-care becoming habit instead of transgression, my body becoming less like a site of argument and more like a home under renovation. Not a perfect home, not an easy home, but a real one. There were moments of joy that I want to honor, because stories like this can become so weighted with conflict that they accidentally imply honesty is only suffering. It isn't. There is joy in hearing your own voice and no longer flinching at it as often. There is joy in choosing clothes because they reflect you rather than because they hide you. There is joy in small routines, in friendship, in being addressed in ways that no longer scrape against your nerves. There is joy in standing in line for coffee as an ordinary person on an ordinary morning and realizing that ordinary is all you wanted. Not attention, not dramatic validation, just the right to participate in your own life without continual internal correction. I remember once catching my reflection in a shop window while walking home with groceries. The posture, the movement, the whole silhouette of me no longer triggered that old split-second alienation. I kept walking, but I smiled in a way I would once have thought impossible. That smile was not about appearance alone. It was about recognition after decades of misrecognition, much of it self-imposed. With more peace came more responsibility. The farther I moved from secrecy, the more I felt obliged to speak about this topic in a way that resisted both sensationalism and simplification. Too many public stories about people like me are either stripped of complexity to make others comfortable, or inflated into spectacle to make others curious. I did not want either. If my life had taught me anything, it was that identity exploration without self-awareness can become self-absorption, and social commentary without empathy can become cruelty. I wanted to offer something more useful. So when younger people asked me questions, or when friends quietly confessed uncertainties of their own, I tried not to hand them conclusions disguised as wisdom. I told them what I wish someone had told me earlier. That confusion is not a character flaw, that secrecy may protect you temporarily, but can deform your relationships if it becomes a lifestyle, that not every feminine impulse in a man means the same thing, that not every trans person has the same path, that mental health matters, that therapy is not surrender, that spouses and family members have real feelings too, that honesty should be timely, compassionate, and as complete as you can manage. That you do not become a better person merely by discovering a hidden truth. You become a better person by how you live once you know it. Most of all, I tell them that dignity is not found in perfect certainty. It is found in refusing to despise yourself while you are still learning. Looking back, one of the strangest parts of this life is how long I believed the enemy was femininity itself. I thought if I could eliminate softness, care, sensitivity, and the parts of me drawn toward feminine expression, I could become solid, uncomplicated, and therefore safe. But the enemy was not femininity. The enemy was fear enforced by shame. Shame made me dishonest. Shame made me avoid help. Shame made me interpret every gentle impulse as evidence against my worth. Shame made me see disclosure as catastrophe rather than relationship. Shame even distorted my love because it encouraged me to offer only the parts of myself I thought would be easiest to accept. Once I saw that, a different moral framework became possible. I could value truth without glorifying disruption. I could value boundaries without calling them rejection. I could value my own emerging identity without demanding that others erase their grief about it. That framework did not solve every problem, but it made me someone I respected more. And self-respect, I have learned, is quieter and sturdier than validation. Validation depends on being mirrored well by others. Self-respect depends on not abandoning yourself when mirroring is imperfect. If I could speak to the version of me standing in that childhood hallway, watching the women in his family move through rituals he did not understand but deeply felt, I would not tell that child, "Don't worry, one day everything will make sense." That would be too easy, and not even fully true. Some things still do not make perfect sense. Lives are not math problems that resolve cleanly if you gather enough data. Instead, I would say this: pay attention to what brings you peace and what requires you to vanish. Do not confuse suppression with goodness. Do not wait until your inner life has become an emergency before seeking language for it. Do not borrow contempt from other people and call it maturity. When you hurt others, acknowledge it without making your own shame the center of the room. When others hurt you through ignorance, discern whether they are incapable of better or merely unpracticed. Build a life with people who can tolerate complexity. Learn to care for your body without treating that care as frivolous or suspect. And when the day comes that some tiny act of tenderness toward yourself reveals how hungry you have been, do not dismiss it just because it looks small from the outside. Entire lives pivot on small permissions. That is really what the skin cream was for me in the end, permission disguised as practicality. A winter night, dry hands, a bathroom light, a scent that stayed on my skin long enough for me to notice I had won. People like dramatic catalysts because they let us point to a single cause and say, "There, that was the moment." But the truth is that moment only mattered because of all the years before it and all the choices after it. The cream did not turn me into someone else. It interrupted my refusal to care for the self that was already there. From that interruption came questions. From questions came honesty. From honesty came pain, change, loss, growth, and a level of peace I once thought belonged to other people. If my story has any educational value, I think it lies there. Not in transformation as spectacle, but in self-recognition as responsibility. Not in crossing a line for thrill, but in learning why the line existed in you so powerfully to begin with. Not in asking the world to celebrate every step, but in building enough inner steadiness that celebration becomes optional. I still have difficult days. I still carry grief. There are people I miss, versions of life I sometimes mourn, and moments when social pressure feels exhausting rather than conquerable. But I no longer wake every morning preparing to impersonate myself. That alone has changed the texture of living more than I can say. And if someone listening to this is not living my exact story, I hope there is still something here for them. Maybe you're not questioning gender at all. Maybe your hidden life takes another form entirely. Maybe the lesson for you is about any identity you have been forced to flatten in order to remain acceptable. Maybe the lesson is about how quickly we judge what we do not understand because judgment feels safer than curiosity. Maybe it is about how families can love each other sincerely and still need to learn new ways of seeing. Maybe it is about how spouses deserve truth, even when truth arrives imperfectly. Maybe it is about how mental health can deteriorate quietly under the weight of performance, and how relief often begins with naming rather than fixing. Maybe it is simply about empathy. Real empathy, not the sentimental kind that asks nothing of us, but the disciplined kind that lets another person be more complicated than the role we assign them. I think the world would be gentler if more of us understood that identity exploration is not always rebellion, not always certainty, and not always spectacle. Sometimes it is the humble, frightening work of becoming legible to yourself without treating anyone else as disposable in the process. There are people who will hear a story like mine and still want a simpler moral. They will want to know whether I was really this or really that all along, whether the marriage should have ended sooner or lasted longer, whether the signs were obvious, whether I chose this, whether it was worth it, whether I regret it, whether one can trace everything back to childhood or biology or loneliness or social permission. I understand the urge. Simplicity calms people. But life has taught me to distrust answers that satisfy curiosity by erasing reality. What I can say is that I spent many years surviving through concealment and several more learning how to live through truth. I can say that crossdressing for me was not a joke, not a fetish, not a costume party, and not the whole story either. It was one of the first honest languages available to a self I had taught to whisper. I can say that transition, in the dimensions it became relevant to me, was not an impulsive leap, but a gradual acknowledgement that my peace and my ethics both required fuller honesty. I can say that the people around me were changed by my truth, sometimes painfully, and that their pain deserved compassion. I can say that I am more present, more accountable, and more humane now than I was when I was trying hardest to be normal. And I can say that the small, mundane practices of self-care I once viewed as forbidden have become symbols of something larger, not femininity alone, but permission to inhabit my life with attention rather than avoidance. In the end, that may be the most universal thing I have learned. We become ourselves not only through dramatic declarations, but through repeated acts of attention. What do I feel? What am I avoiding? What story am I telling so that I do not have to tell a truer one? Whom am I protecting and whom am I punishing with my silence? What habits keep me alive and what habits keep me hidden? Which forms of discomfort are the ordinary price of growth and which are the warning signs of self-betrayal? These are not questions reserved for people like me. They are human questions. My path happened to lead through crossdressing, gender exploration, marriage strain, therapy, grief, and a painstaking reconstruction of identity. Someone else's path may lead through another kind of secret entirely. But I think we all diminish when we build our lives around being acceptable at the cost of being knowable. And I think we all recover, at least in part, when we practice the terrifying art of showing up more honestly while remaining responsible for the impact of that honesty. So that is the story as faithfully as I can tell it now. Not a spectacle, not a cautionary tale, not a victory lap, just a life I spent too long misunderstanding and then, little by little, began to live. If all you remember is the title, it will sound absurdly small. I used my wife's skin cream and everything changed. But if you have listened this far, then you know what really changed was not my skin. It was my willingness to stop treating my own tenderness as a threat. It was my willingness to seek help before secrecy hollowed me out completely. It was my willingness to admit that love and truth can collide without either one being fake. It was my willingness to let grief teach me rather than embitter me. It was my willingness to accept that identity is not something proved by performance, but something clarified by sustained honesty, humility, and care. I am still learning. I suspect I always will be. But I am learning now from inside my life instead of from a locked room beside it, and that difference is everything. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.